So my name is Brandon Freed, and this is my theory of knowledge presentation. So my real-life situation is the recent passing of SB 11 in Texas, more popularly known as the Campus Carry Law. This law went into effect August 1st of this year, and it legalizes the carry of concealed handguns on campus, provided that the carrier has a concealed carry permit. And it also legalizes the storage of these handguns in dormitories. And this law applies to all state and public colleges, with private universities still given the choice to ban. So supporters of this law believe that the carrying of firearms by licensed students and staff will positively affect the safety of all personnel on the campus. And on the other hand, opponents of the law believe that it is putting students and staff in danger by adding weapons to an environment that frequently involves drugs and alcohol. And while analyzing my real-life situation, I asked some questions regarding the overall reliability of the law. Questions like, if firearms are allowed to be carried on campus, how will it affect the overall environment of the campuses in Texas? And how will the carriers determine what an ethical use of their firearm is? And I also asked, how can somebody determine when an individual can be trusted with a firearm, and who determines when that person can be trusted? And I also looked at the requirements to receive a concealed carry handgun permit in the state of Texas. And one of them is that you are not incapable of exercising sound judgment with respect to the proper use and storage of the handgun. And this can be connected to the way of knowing intuition, because this will be the main force in exercising this judgment. And other requirements include that a person must not be chemically dependent, and must also be fully qualified under federal and state law to purchase a handgun. This means that the person must be in a stable emotional state, which connects to emotion as a way of knowing, because in order to use emotion reliably, you need to have some control over it. And this brings me to my knowledge question, which is, to what extent can intuition and emotion be trusted to uphold one's ethics? And so my first development will be centered around the statement, those who have been deemed fit to carry by the government can be trusted to carry a firearm. But as a broader claim, I will use, if a government deems an individual capable and trustworthy of performing a certain action, then that individual should be trusted when performing said action. And so I'll be using the way of knowing intuition. And so when faced with controversial situations, a person may have to make decisions very quickly, sometimes without analyzing the whole situation, which raises the question, how long does it take for somebody to understand the situation to a point where reason trumps intuition as the main way of knowing when making a decision. This time frame is different for different people in different situations. And many times people do not have the time or choose not to take the time to fully comprehend a situation before making a decision, and this forces them to rely on intuition. So intuition and ethics are very closely related, because the main factor when relying on intuition is one's ethics, and one's instincts. Instincts are a natural way of acting or thinking, and some are natural in all humans, but some are learned from important factors in your life, such as parents, teachers, and other role models. And these are the same factors that tend to develop your core beliefs or code of ethics, which help you decide what is right and wrong. So they're very connected, but these instincts can also cause you to make rash decisions without thinking. And one example that demonstrates intuition's power are the experiments of Stanley Milgram. In these experiments, a volunteer is given the title teacher and an actor is given the title student. The volunteer is told to teach the student word pairs, and when the student gets one wrong, the teacher is told to give them a shock. The voltage is increased each time, and through a wall, the teacher can hear recordings of the student begging him to stop. A scientist tells the teacher to continue despite the student's pain, and a vast majority of the volunteers continued to the end, disregarding the student's cries of pain. This is related to intuition through the learned instinct of obeying people with authority. All through your childhood, you are told to obey your parents, teachers, and other important adults. And so in this, they rely on their instinct of obeying that authority to make the decision to continue in the experiments. So one might use the experiments of Stanley Milgram to counter my original claim, saying that in these experiments, intuition is used to go against their own ethics, forcing a person to either follow an inherited instinct or uphold their ethics, but not both. Therefore, they cannot be trusted to perform the action for risk that they run into a situation such as this. But to reinforce my original claim, which is if a government deems an individual capable and trustworthy of performing a certain action, then that individual should be trusted. I propose the rebuttal: the government will not cause a person to experience a situation such as these experiments because the government acts in the best interests of its citizens. In the Stanley Milgram experiments, the volunteer is being trusted to denounce his ethics, whereas the government will trust you to uphold them, causing you to be in situations where your instincts are being used to uphold them, not go against them. And this connects to the original real-life situation because with the campus carry law, the government is trusting students and staff that carry the firearm to adhere to a moral and ethical code if a situation arises. And for the second development, I propose the claim: when faced with a decision, one cannot completely disregard their own emotions. Therefore, they cannot completely rule out emotional bias as a contributing factor. Emotion as a way of knowing is used when making all decisions, whether you want it to or not. The impact it makes can be positive or negative depending on the emotion, and how strong the emotion is impacts what effect it has on the decision made. Which raises the question, at what point does emotional bias corrupt one's ethical decision making? This, again, depends on the individual. For a person who gets worked up very easily and has no problem showing or feeling strong emotions, it may take very little to sway their opinion from one side to another. But for a person who doesn't let many things bother them, who is usually pretty calm, it could take a very strong emotional response to a situation to have a substantial effect on their decision. So different emotions can have different effects when making decisions involving ethics. Positive emotions can cause a person to have a more generous or caring response, whereas negative emotions can cause a person to have a more harsh or relentless response. And one example of how this has played a large part, or how emotion has played a large part in decision making, is the U.S. Army Detention Center of Abu Ghraib. This prison is located in Iraq during the war in Iraq, which was part of the larger war on terror. Terrorism is a subject that causes many people to feel negative emotions, which in turn can cause those affected to make decisions that they otherwise would not have made. In 2003 and 2004, there was a large amount of misconduct in the treatment of prisoners, and according to a report done by Major General Antonio Taguba, the following abuses, along with others, happened. These included punching, slapping, and kicking detainees, videotaping and photographing naked male and female detainees, forcibly arranging detainees in various sexually explicit positions for photographing, forcing detainees to remove their clothing and keeping them naked for several days at a time, arranging naked male detainees in a pile and jumping on them, and using military working dogs to intimidate and frighten the detainees. Clearly, these abuses and others not mentioned that are equally horrible are unacceptable, and to most people bewildering as to how and why this could happen in a United States ran prison. Most people would not think of going to such a horrible graphic ends while under command of the USA, and due to the fact that this was part of the war on terror, in the view of these military police personnel, all of the detainees in Abu Ghraib were associated with all of the past horrible terrorist attacks on the U.S. and abroad, and they allowed the negative emotions brought up by the terrorist attacks like shock, sadness, and mainly anger to influence their decision-making while running the prison. And as a counterclaim, one might say that with help and advice from outside sources, one's emotion can be reduced to such a small factor that it makes no difference in the decision made. Or with justification, emotion can be disregarded as a deciding factor, because with justification, emotion can turn into reason. But as a rebuttal, I say that even when others offer advice on a subject, emotion cannot be eliminated as an impacting factor, because all those who offer advice bring in their own emotional bias, and this bias can either reinforce or weaken the thoughts of the decision maker. Either way, it impacts the decision. And this links to the campus carry law, because everybody experiences a wide variety of emotions throughout the time you spend at college and even on a day-to-day basis, and these emotions are going to be used by the individuals that are carrying firearms and going through their days. And, for some conclusions, I conclude that although the government has very strict guidelines on who they believe can be trusted with a firearm, they cannot 100% account for all individuals. I conclude that one's intuition and instincts can have a powerful effect on their decisions. And finally, I conclude that emotional bias can never be completely ruled out as an impacting factor in decision making. And some universal implications of these conclusions are: by examining your learned instincts and researching those viewpoints of others from a different upbringing, you can learn to have a broader view of many situations, and by further understanding your own emotions, you can better understand how these affect your decision making and work to lessen the emotional bias. And this connects to other real life situations, such as prisoners being allowed out on parole. The government is trusting these prisoners to go back to how it was before prison and disregard the emotions and learned instincts from prison to uphold proper ethics.